So the last part of the Echo framework that I've talked about, you have evaluate, you have conversation, and then you have honing and ownership. So those last two, instead of making two long videos, I think because they're so connected, I'm just going to keep it at one video. So honing and ownership again. We went through what it means to evaluate the workflows at hand, what it means to engage with AI conversationally instead of trying to get this perfect prompt off the start. And then now, as we move into hone, the idea behind honing what you're putting out is you kind of want to look at it as like good writing, right? When you talk to any good writer, they'll kind of tell you, when you're writing an essay or something like that, you have your initial output where you're just getting everything out there, right? You have that first draft that is just getting at all the ideas, getting that rough output that you want. And so those first two steps of the evaluating and the conversation get you that rough output when it comes to AI, right? But then that honing process, that's really where the product is actually made. Most good writers will tell you they spend more time editing than the actual initial output. And the reason that's so important is that's what actually gets you an output that's not just generic AI slop, right? So I'm not just talking about copywriting. Obviously, it's really important there, but even when it comes to making agents, like you really want to make sure you're fine tuning that agent, right? You have the initial workflow, you have what you think you want it to work out as, which is super important. And then you kind of start to see, okay, this is how it's actually working. Oh, okay, there's a little bug there, or okay, it's not even a bug, but that's not exactly how we intended it. And you start working through that. And that might not just be like a one-shot session where you're sitting down and doing that. That might be talking with your team over the course of a few weeks, right? You kind of want to have a plan for this is what we're going to test at different stages. This is how we're going to fine tune it. And that's that honing process. Again, for, a single person putting out a piece of work, kind of following that same mentality of, okay, now you have that rough output before you're really putting it out to like public production, before you post it, whatever the purpose of the AI that you're using is, you want to make sure you're honing it. You want to make sure you're really going through of like, is this what I intended? Is this the way I want it? Am I okay with putting this out? And again, that's why it's so connected with this idea of ownership, which I really think is going to be more and more important in the age of AI. Of at the end of the day, you can say whatever you want about AI put this out, but you have to take credit for the good and the bad. So, people will talk a lot about like AI output and what that means. But at the end of the day, especially at a company, especially when you're putting out something business related, you're going to have to take ownership of that. So if you're putting a proposal out, if you're putting a slide deck, if you're creating a social post, you can, and something goes wrong, you can't just be like, oh, AI did that. Like that's coming from you. You made that choice, right? And you put out that final output. So that's why it's important not to just check off the box, this whole idea of human in the loop. It can't just be like, oh, yeah, I looked at it. Okay, good to go. Like that's not human in the loop. And that's a lot of people's tendency is to just kind of cave into what AI says. There's somebody I heard that talked about like cognitive surrender to AI, right? Where we're just like, because AI has gotten so good, now we just have this tendency to look at what AI puts out in certain cases, and we're just like, it's probably better than what I would have done. And sure, for initial output, that might be true, but that doesn't mean like the whole idea of AI doing something better doesn't mean that you still don't have that ownership. You still don't have to hone it and really get it to where you're comfortable saying, I put this work out, right? Again, even if AI was in the process. The other part that you need to understand is that that's what people are ultimately paying for, especially in the business context, right? Like even before AI, people could have outsourced all kinds of things, right? Like they could, let's just say for like engineering, they could have outsourced to other countries, or they could have hired really cheap labor like directly, right? They don't have to work with a company to do that within, let's just say, for example, within the US, even if they know the company they're hiring is using outsourced labor or is using white label services, they want to go with that name brand because they know they are taking ownership for that and they have a reputation to protect. And that's going to be increasingly the case, not just with larger companies, but even if you're an employee at a company, to be like, what people are really paying for is the fact that they want to put the weight of that output that they're looking for, the weight of whatever it is on you, right? They want you to take the ownership. That's what they're paying for because they know a lot of these things, okay, they could do with AI or they could hire cheap labor to do it, or they can figure it out, they can do it internally, et cetera. All these different options are there. But at the end of the day, the money is going to come in ownership and being able to ultimately point fingers at somebody if something goes wrong. And so you really need to be able to see in the age of AI, like how can you take more and more ownership of what you're putting out, regardless of the way that it's done, right? Regardless of whether you're using AI a little bit, a lot, medium, whatever it is, that it doesn't ultimately matter that much, because what's going to matter is, can you say that you are okay with that output? And can you deal with the consequences of that if something goes wrong? And that's, again, what companies are going to pay for, right? Because it's going to be increasingly the case where, yeah, technically speaking, people can put stuff out, whether it's software, whether it's whole agentic workflows, whether like, actual projects and stuff. Sure, the AI can do it. But the question becomes, who's taking the ownership of that? And even within companies, that idea needs to be really thoroughly understood of like who's ultimately responsible, even if there's an agent doing these work, like the workflows, right? I think a lot of companies still haven't figured that out. Like that's where governance comes in of like, yeah, we have these agentic workflows set up. Yeah, we have these different things going on. But then it's like, who's taking ownership if company data leaks? Who's taking ownership if the output isn't really what you would put out normally as a company? Who's taking ownership if a client isn't happy with the results? All these kind of questions come into that ownership question, right? And that's where, again, honing the results. Yeah, again, I think about it. And another example is like I was a barber for a long time, and it's like you always go through the full haircut, and then you kind of detail it afterwards, right? Or think of it like a sculptor, right? Where it's like they're taking this rough brick of stone that the AI kind of gives you, and you're getting it to where you want. You're taking out the messy stuff, and you want to take ownership of that. So that's where like that honing and ownership really kind of works together to get it to where you want it. Even though AI has like exponentially increased the speed and ease of output, it's really important. And one last point on that, like a lot of people say like, oh, AI has actually made it harder because I'm spending more time editing what it puts out. And that's a fair argument, and in some cases that's true. But I would argue that like, yes, even if you're spending more time, you're getting more done if used correctly, because you would have been stuck in analysis paralysis if you didn't have even that really rough output. Because oftentimes you need something to work with, even if it's really bad. First of all, I don't think it's that bad anymore. It's getting so good, depending on the project. But you need something to work with, oftentimes, to really get it to where you want it, rather than working from scratch. So that's another way to think about it, is instead of being like, hey, if I had just written this on my own, or if I had just done this project on my own, it would have been a lot easier. Sometimes that's true. I don't want to set that aside. But oftentimes, maybe that's not exactly true, because you're assuming you would have done that initial output in the time that you needed to do it. So just food for thought there again. So evaluate the task at hand, engage with AI conversationally instead of trying to get that perfect prompt off the bat. You got to hone those results and ultimately take ownership. That's what's going to differentiate you. That's where, when people talk about judgment, taste, all these things, that's where it all kind of ties in together.